exclusive content, and where you can also publish your own content too. And just to remind you, I do live streams on Locals every Wednesday. The second thing I wanted to say is that if you want to get regular updates of what is going on in the war, you can do so by going to our Locals homepage, checking out Alex Christophorou's update, and I would also advise you to follow our regular live streams on the DURAN channel, which from time to time are joined by the invaluable Gonzalo Lira, who is obviously present in Ukraine. He's actually present in Kiev. He has family in other cities, in another city. Perhaps I shouldn't say without his permission, but he's got contacts all over Ukraine, and he's therefore able to give us what I consider to be authoritative and definitive updates of what is happening. Now, as I've discussed on many occasions, again, I am not a military expert, and you can find all sorts of other people in the media who claim to be military experts and who profess to have a more comprehensive understanding of military strategy than I do. I will venture, however, my own opinion, which is that the way in which the war is being described in most of the media in the West has little connection to reality. I get the sense that most of the people who are either writing on in the pages of the newspapers and websites of mainstream media, or who appear on television, have little familiarity with actual war, and perhaps are not very familiar with the country, and have little understanding of the great nature of events which is taking place. My own understanding of the situation, which is corroborated by Gonzalo, but also from other persons whom I have much more confidence in, is that the main fighting in Ukraine, the really important battle, is not taking place in Kiev, where, contrary to what many people think, there has never been an assault by the Russian army on the center, seeking to capture the center of the city. Rather, the main battle is being conducted in eastern Ukraine, where the larger part of the Ukrainian army, numbering perhaps 60,000 men, is about to be encircled. And if that encirclement is completed, the Russians refer to encirclements as cauldrons, then obviously the position of the military in eastern Ukraine, the Ukrainian military in eastern Ukraine, will become extremely difficult, perhaps even desperate, and perhaps at that point we will be approaching the end of the war, the active period of the war. Now, I say that, I should say that always across the media I read about how the war has slowed down, how the Russian offensive has slowed down. All I would say is we're in the 5th day of this conflict, which began on Thursday. I think that to expect victory in 5 days, if that's what people imagined, well, it's possibly not realistic. And regardless, it seems strange by comparison with wars that have been fought and been hailed as successful before, like the US invasion of Iraq, which overthrew Saddam Hussein, where I recall that a much larger US force than the Russian force deployed in Ukraine took 3 weeks to reach Baghdad. And of course, there was the war in Yugoslavia, the bombing war in Yugoslavia, which took 78 days. So 5 days, it seems to me, is far too soon to make any value judgments about the pace and tempo of this conflict. And in any event, from what I can understand, it does seem as if things are probably now moving gradually towards some sort of final denouement, with the likely probability of the encirclement of the Ukrainian army in eastern Ukraine. Lastly, I would say that over the last couple of hours, the Russian Air Force, which has been remarkably absent from much of the fighting, most of the airstrikes we've been hearing about appear to have been carried out by long-range cruise missiles. But the Russian Air Force has now appeared. There's film now of Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers operating, especially in the area around Kharkiv, where a major battle of some sort appears to be underway. And there's also growing evidence that heavy artillery from Russia is starting to be deployed to eastern Ukraine. So that, it seems to me, is all I'm going to say about the actual progress of the battle. If you want more detailed opinions about it, then I'm afraid you're going to have to search out and find those people who seem to understand these things better. I would recommend first and foremost Scott Ritter, but of course there are others too. Anyway, turning to other things, perhaps because despite all the brave words and the heroic poses, the Ukrainians sense that the war is turning against them. They finally turned up to a negotiation in Belarus, and though the negotiation doesn't seem to have achieved very much for the moment, at least the two sides have continued talking. What I will say is that the Russian delegation is led by a man called Medinsky, who is a former culture minister, very close to Putin, and from my knowledge, something of a hardliner. And the other major head of delegation is a professional diplomat called Leonid Slutsky. So these are two rather tough characters, and I suspect they've been specially selected to meet with the Ukrainians precisely for that reason. The Ukrainians, to the best extent that I can understand, appear to be led by their former president, the man who was the first president of Ukraine, Leonid Kravchuk. He was the person who led Ukraine to independence. He was also, by the way, the last first secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party, whilst Ukraine was still part of the Soviet Union. And Medinsky, the head of the Russian delegation, who is notably, as I said, hardline and notably anti-communist, and he and Kravchuk may find that they have some difficulties establishing a personal connection. I say that, I must qualify it by stressing that I'm not absolutely sure that Kravchuk is indeed leading the Ukrainian delegation. Certainly a lot of senior Ukrainian officials, however, there, including apparently Ukraine's defense minister, which I find rather interesting, and I wonder why indeed he's there conducting a negotiation like this. Anyway, that, it seems to me, is the main military situation. The big story today, however, is the economic war which the West is now waging against Russia. And of course, the anticipation, the expectation was that we would see a total collapse of the ruble today. Well, it didn't quite happen. The ruble did indeed fall and fell a lot, but decisive action by Russia's central bank seems to have stemmed the decline. And at the moment, it seems to be trading around $100, 100 rubles to the dollar, which is significantly below its Friday night close, but is not quite the collapse that people perhaps expected. What I would say about that is this economic war is still ongoing. It's dangerous, it seems to me, to leap to any conclusions as to the outcome, but I suspect that Russia is proving to be a more difficult nut than perhaps some people in Washington and Brussels may have imagined. The bigger point I would make, however, is that there's growing evidence apparently across the financial system that this economic war is starting to create growing stresses, with oil and gas and food prices rising, with growing fears that because of the disconnection from SWIFT and the seizure of Russian reserves, defaults are going to start cascading through the system as Russian banks cut off from SWIFT find it difficult to fulfill their financial obligations. And all this at a time when Western economies are massively overextended and are still struggling with the effects of the lockdowns and of the pandemic. It seems to me is going to cause problems which perhaps those people who rushed into these sanctions may not have anticipated. The other extraordinary decision for me is a bizarre decision by Germany to massively increase defense spending, which I wonder how sustainable it's going to be. So the economic war goes on. As I said, Russia is looking somewhat more resilient than many expected. I strongly suspect that Russia is step by step going to work towards establishing capital controls. Some of them are already in effect in place. And it seems to me that at the end of this process, we will start to see a completely different financial and economic global architecture. Perhaps the other story that is important in terms of this economic war is that two of the biggest economies, China, obviously, by some definitions, the biggest economy, and India, perhaps in that second case, very much to the West's surprise, are refusing to participate. The Indians and the Chinese refusing to impose sanctions on Russia and continuing to trade with Russia. So we will see what happens there. I understand that the SWIFT disconnection has so far proved very partial. Gazprom Bank, the Russian bank that receives the payments for Russia's gas to the West, has not been sanctioned, and I suspect it's also going to start receiving the oil receipts as well. But Gazprom, the Russian energy producer, has apparently now said that there is no gas left at all in Europe's underground gas system, despite the fact that the Russians actually stepped up gas supplies over the last few days. And I wonder what that means. Anyway, we are obviously in a state of intense conflict. My own guess is that the economic battle is going to prove an extremely hard slog for both sides. The Russian government met today. Putin met with all his chief economic officials, including the Prime Minister, Mr. Mishustin, who's, by the way, also been sanctioned. And the Duma, the Russian parliament, is due to meet on the 4th of March to debate the situation in the economy as well. And as I said, the Russian press spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has said that the Russians anticipated all the moves that have been taken against them and are working through the various plans that they've taken in response to those moves. Whether that is true or not, obviously, I cannot say. So the economic battle is going to be a hard slog. It seems to me that some kind of a recession in Russia is now inevitable, but it seems to me that the prospects of a recession in the West are now growing by the day. And I again wonder whether people in the United States and in the European Union have thought this through properly and fully. My own guess, however, is that the military side of things is now, as I said, coming rapidly to a conclusion, and that we will see over the next couple of days, or perhaps week or so, some kind of final conclusion to the ground war in Ukraine. And we will see whether that leads to a compromise in the negotiations which are taking place in Belarus, or whether instead the Ukrainian government will decide to go down fighting, surrounded as it apparently now essentially is in Kiev. Anyway, regardless, That is my brief summary of the situation as it seems to me to be tonight. There'll be more from me tomorrow, but as I said, please do follow Alex's regular updates, which you can find on our locals page and on his own channel. And please also